Well, ladies and gentlemen, in this video, I am going to be discussing the future of the Gabba, also its past, and some of the big questions that need to be answered with regards to this stadium. Now, the Gabba is the premier cricket ground in the city of Brisbane, Queensland. It is also the host of the Brisbane Lions in the AFL, and in my view, it is one of the worst stadium situations today in Australia. The ground is officially known as the Brisbane Cricket Ground, but colloquially it is known as the Gabba due to it being located in the suburb of Woolloongabba. It did first open all the way back in 1895 as a cricket ground, and initially it just hosted local matches, but in 1931, it did replace the Brisbane Exhibition Ground, or the ECA, as the premier cricket ground in Brisbane for both first class and test cricket. It did receive its first major renovation in 1971, where they did install a greyhound track around the perimeter, and it was one of the first greyhound racing tracks in Australia to be able to host night races. And certainly unique when it comes to cricket grounds with having a greyhound track around the outside. And around 16 years later, the Brisbane Bears did come into the AFL, but initially they were actually based in the city of the Gold Coast and not in Brisbane, even though they were called the Brisbane Bears. They did play at the Carrara Stadium, which today is known as People First Stadium. And after some initial success with crowds, they did really start to struggle after a few years financially. They were drawing really poor crowds. They did have some issues with the ownership, and there were a lot of rumours that the club would have to fold or relocate to another state. There was some talk about them merging with the Sydney Swans, who also were struggling at the time. Also some dialogue about a potential relocation to Adelaide or Tasmania. But ultimately they did decide just to relocate around 70 k's up the road to the Gabba and actually play in Brisbane, the city after which they were named. And prior to the relocation of the Bears, the Gabba did receive a renovation. They did remove the greyhound track after around 20 years. And they also began construction of new stands to convert the ground into an all-seater stadium. And that project was done over around 12 years, where it was finally built up to its current configuration. You do have a pretty uniform design with a two-deck seating approach encompassing the whole ground. You do also have that fabric material on the roof, and the total cost for that project was around 128 million Australian dollars at the time. The final capacity after the redevelopment was around 37,000, and interestingly, one of the old grandstands, when they did the renovation, they actually relocated it to Cazaly Stadium in Cairns, where it is still located today. Now, the stadium did host some soccer matches for the 2000 Sydney Olympics. That was one of the reasons it did get the renovation. And the last work it did receive was some minor upgrades before the 2020 AFL Grand Final. If you do remember, that was not able to be played in Melbourne due to the pandemic restrictions at the time. And the AFL did want to reward the state of Queensland for hosting a large chunk of that year's competition with the Grand Final. The renovation was really only some upgrades to the media and corporate facilities for that grand final. But more or less the ground is the same as it has been since around 2005, when the last stage of that major renovation was finished. Now, if you haven't been to the ground, you might think it looks pretty good on TV, looks quite modern, definitely a good atmosphere when it is full for the Lions games, but the stadium is actually decrepit. It has really small concourses. It is very difficult to get in and out of the ground. There's not a big footprint around the ground. It is sort of located next to a major road, next to a school and some residential area. So it is a typical suburban ground that has been retrofitted basically to host high-level sport. If you look at the exterior, it is really ugly with that exposed concrete. You do see the underside of the seating terraces, and it just looks like basically a shell from the outside. Now, the future of the Gabba was seemingly secured when Brisbane was awarded the 2032 Olympics, and the Gabba was set to be the centrepiece of the Games by virtue of hosting the opening and closing ceremonies as well as the athletics events. And the plan was for the stadium to basically get knocked down and rebuilt as a 50,000 seat venue. Very modern design. Total cost was set to be $2.7 billion, which would make it the most expensive stadium in Australian history. But due to public outrage, cost blowouts, the rising cost of living and optics, the Queensland state government actually abandoned the plans to renovate the Gabba and ultimately they decided to redevelop the Queensland Sport and Athletics Centre, or QSAC, to host the games at a total cost of $1.6 billion. But the plan for the QSAC wasn't for it to be the premier oval sporting stadium in Brisbane. It really is only meant to be effectively a temporary stadium, and it will be converted back into a 14,000 seat athletics centre after the games. And as at the time of this video, that will be the host of the Brisbane Olympics in terms of the major stadium. There was also another proposal to build a new stadium in Victoria Park, which is basically a parkland area just out of the city. And that would be a totally new permanent stadium, but the bill for that was actually more expensive than the Gabba rebuild, estimated at $3.4 billion. And presumably post-Olympics, the Lions and cricket would relocate to this stadium and the Gabba would get demolished and probably developed into housing or retail spaces. But obviously due to the cost of that, the government said, no, we're not doing that. We are going to do the QSAC redevelopment. I did make a video about the Brisbane Olympics. If you are interested to find out more about this, I do think the current plan is a really terrible idea and is extremely embarrassing for both Brisbane and Australia on the world stage. But go and check out that video if you are interested. Now, supposedly the Gabba is getting a small upgrade for the Olympics under this new plan. We don't have any details yet, but I think it's more than likely it will just be a minor upgrade of the amenities and some of the facilities around the ground. It really won't be anything major because they are focusing on that cost-cutting regime. And the question is, where does this leave the Brisbane Lions and also cricket post-Olympics? Are they going to be playing in an obsolete stadium for the next 20 years after the Olympics? We know due to the cost of the Olympic Games, it is really going to be a tough sell for the Queensland taxpayers to fund another new stadium just after they've just funded the most expensive project in the state's history. So as it stands currently, the government is going to pour $1.6 billion into what is going to be a white elephant effectively after the games. And the Lions and cricket are going to be playing in a stadium that is completely outdated for the foreseeable future. Now, I do think there is a chance that if the Liberal Party win this year's state election in Queensland, and they are up big in the polls, they are projected to win, I think they do pivot and say, look, we can't go ahead with this QSAC plan. It is completely ridiculous. We are going to either do the Gabba or do that new Victoria Park stadium. And you do see the Lions and cricket go to Victoria Park after the games if they do choose to go down that route. The official position from the Liberal Party is they aren't going to be going ahead with either of those projects, but I think there is a chance they could change due to public pressure. We do still have 8 years before the Olympics. And once they secure the election, they might just say, look, I know it's unpopular, but we're going ahead with a new venue, due to the fact it is going to be extremely embarrassing to host the Olympics in such a Mickey Mouse stadium, basically. But the big losers out of this are the Brisbane Lions and also cricket. They really don't have any say in this project. It is purely dependent on what happens with that stadium for the Olympics. We know the Lions are definitely not going to relocate. They do draw very well in Brisbane. They have been quite successful in the past 5 or 6 seasons, even though they haven't won a premiership. Brisbane is the third biggest market in Australia, so the Lions definitely aren't going anywhere. But we do know with Cricket Australia, when they are allocating the host venues for test matches and other cricket events, they are really going to put the Gabba down to the bottom of the list when it comes to stadiums. When you do compare it to Optus Stadium, Adelaide Oval, or even the new facility that is being built down in Hobart. So the Brisbane public will be missing out on a lot of top tier events if they don't get a new stadium out of the Olympics. I think the best situation here is if the new government do proceed to rebuild the Gabba or the new stadium, and that does set up the Brisbane Oval sports scene for the next 40, 50 years. But as I said, no fixed plan from the Liberal Party to proceed with either of those projects at this point. Either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more.